At 04:15 on the morning of June 3, 1916, Lance Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow sat in a mud-filled crater near Mount Sorrel in the Ypres salient, Belgium. He was holding a rifle that every other soldier in the Canadian Corps despised. It was the Ross Mark III Model 1910. To the infantrymen in the trenches, this weapon was a death trap. It was long, heavy, and notoriously temperamental. In the mud of Flanders, the Ross had a fatal flaw. If dirt got into the straight pull-bolt mechanism, the gun would jam solid. Soldiers had died kicking the bolts of their rifles, trying to force them open while Germans charged at them with bayonets. They called it the Canadian Club. They called it the jamming rod. When officers weren't looking, Canadian soldiers would throw their Ross rifles into the mud and steal Lee Enfield rifles from dead British soldiers. They mocked anyone who still carried the Ross. They said carrying one was a form of suicide. But Francis Pegahmagabow, a 25-year-old Ojibwe warrior from the Perry Island First Nation, did not throw his Ross rifle away. He cleaned it. He wrapped the bolt in canvas from an old sandbag to keep the mud out. He dismantled it 3 times a day, oiling the intricate machining that made it fail for others but made it perfect for him. While the infantry hated the Ross for its fragility, Pegahmagabow loved it for one specific reason: accuracy. The Ross was essentially a high-end sporting rifle forced into a war it wasn't built for. It had a heavy barrel, a fast action, and iron sights that were precise to 600 yards. In the hands of a panicked conscript, it was garbage. In the hands of a master hunter who knew how to stalk silently and keep his weapons sterile, it was a surgical instrument. The situation at Mount Sorrel was catastrophic. On June 2nd, the German 13th Corps had launched a massive artillery bombardment. They fired mines, high explosives, and gas shells. They obliterated the Canadian forward trenches. Then they detonated 4 underground mines. The earth heaved. Entire companies of men were vaporized. The Germans seized the high ground. They captured Mount Sorrel and Hill 62. The Canadians were pushed back into the valley, exposed, outgunned, and disorganized. At 05:00 on June 3rd, the rain began. It was a cold, driving rain that turned the battlefield into a slurry of gray clay and blood. Pegahmagabow was operating alone in no man's land. He was a scout and a sniper. His mission was to delay the German consolidation of the hill. He had to stop them from bringing up machine guns. He had to blind them. The German officers on top of Mount Sorrel felt secure. They had the high ground. They had machine gun nests covering every approach. They laughed at the disorganized Canadians below. They didn't know that a single ghost was crawling toward them through the corpse-filled craters. Pegahmagabow moved with a technique he had learned hunting game in the Ontario forests. He didn't crawl on his hands and knees. He slithered. He kept his body flat against the mud, using his elbows and toes to inch forward. He pushed his Ross rifle ahead of him, wrapped in rags. He stopped every few feet to listen. The battlefield was a cacophony of artillery thuds and distant screaming, but Pegahmagabow was listening for something else. The click-clack of a German Mauser bolt or the squeak of a machine gun mount swivel. At 06:12, he found his first position. A shell hole about 300 yards from the German line on Hill 62. He slid into the water at the bottom of the crater. It was waist-deep and smelled of rot and cordite. He found a dry ledge near the rim. He slowly unwrapped his Ross rifle. He checked the action. He wiped a microscopic speck of mud from the front sight blade. He loaded a stripper clip of 5.303 British rounds. These were standard Mark VII ball ammunition, 174 grains. He raised his head slowly. He didn't look over the rim. He looked through a gap in the debris. He scanned the German line. He saw movement. A German observer was setting up a periscope on the parapet. The observer was careless. He exposed his head for a second to adjust the clamp. Range 280 yards, wind light blowing left to right, angle 15 degrees uphill. Pegahmagabow adjusted his rear aperture sight. He didn't use a telescopic scope. Scopes glinted in the sun. Scopes fogged up. He used the iron sights. He aligned the post. He exhaled. At 0618 he fired. The Ross rifle cracked. The sound was distinct, sharper than the thud of a Lee Enfield. The bullet struck the German observer in the throat. He dropped backward into the trench without a sound. Pegahmagabow didn't watch him fall. He instantly worked the straight pull bolt, clack, clack, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. He remained motionless. 2 minutes later, a German helmet appeared. A second soldier looking for the sniper. Pegahmagabow waited. He knew the psychology of the enemy. They would be angry. They would be rash. The German soldier leaned out with his rifle, trying to spot the muzzle flash. Shot 2. The German soldier's helmet spun off. He collapsed. Pegahmagabow ducked down. He knew the Germans would triangulate the sound. Seconds later, a machine gun burst tore up the mud on the lip of his crater. They knew roughly where he was, but they couldn't see him. This began a 48-hour duel that would become legend. Pegahmagabow wasn't just killing soldiers, he was playing a psychological game. He knew the Germans mocked the Canadians' equipment. He knew they felt superior. He wanted to use that arrogance against them. He waited for the machine gun to stop. At 0745 he moved. He didn't retreat. He moved laterally, crawling 40 yards to the right into a ruined drainage ditch. The mud here was thicker, like glue. It coated his uniform. It coated his face. He looked like a golem made of earth. He checked his rifle again. The Ross action was clean. He kept the bolt covered with his hand as he crawled. From this new angle, he could see the side of a German machine gun nest that had been pinning down a Canadian platoon. The gunners were protected from the front by a steel shield, but they were exposed from the flank. Range 340 yards. Pegahmagabow rested the rifle on a sandbag. He aimed at the loader feeding the belt into the MG-08 Spandau. Shot 3. The loader slumped over the gun. The gunner turned, confused. Shot 4. The gunner fell. The machine gun fell silent. By noon on June 3rd, Pegahmagabow had killed 8 German soldiers. The Germans on Mount Sorrel were realizing they had a problem. They weren't facing a unit, they were facing an invisible marksman. They stopped moving openly. They started using trench dogs' mirrors on sticks to look over the parapet. Pegahmagabow lay in the mud eating a piece of dried beef jerky. He hadn't slept in 24 hours. His eyes were burning from the gas residue in the soil. He watched the German lines. He saw a glimmer of light, a sniper scope. The Germans had brought up a specialist. This was the most dangerous moment. A German sniper with a scoped Mauser Jugger 98 was hunting him. The German had optics. Pegahmagabow had iron sights. At 1420, Pegahmagabow saw a helmet rise slowly. It had a cloth cover. It was moving too smoothly. A decoy, a puppet on a stick. The German sniper was trying to draw his fire. Pegahmagabow didn't shoot. He scanned the area around the decoy. 5 yards to the left of the decoy, near the base of a shattered tree stump, he saw a disturbance in the dirt, a small hole in a steel plate, a loophole. The German sniper was hiding behind the plate, waiting for Pegahmagabow to shoot the helmet. Pegahmagabow adjusted his aim. He aimed for the loophole. It was a target maybe 4 inches wide at 300 yards. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet passed through the loophole. There was a dull clank of metal, then silence. The decoy helmet dropped. The German sniper did not fire again. As night fell on June 3rd, the rain intensified. Most soldiers would have retreated to the rear lines for warmth. Pegahmagabow stayed out. He knew the darkness was his ally. He crawled closer. He got within 150 yards of the German wire. He could hear them talking. He could smell their tobacco smoke. He wasn't just sniping now, he was scouting. He counted the number of sentries. He mapped the location of the new trench mortars. He wrote the coordinates in a small notebook, shielding the paper from the rain with his body, but he also continued to kill. At 0200 on June 4th, a German sentry lit a cigarette. The flare of the match illuminated his face for 2 seconds. Crack. The sentry fell. Pegahmagabow moved again, 10 yards to the left. At 03:15, a German officer came out to check the sentries. He used a flashlight with a red lens thinking it was safe. Crack. The flashlight shattered. The officer fell. By dawn on June 4th, the German morale on that sector of Mount Sorrel was breaking. They had lost 14 men in 24 hours to a single rifle. They didn't know it was a Ross rifle. They didn't know it was a weapon they called broken. They thought they were facing a platoon of elite marksmen. They started firing wildly into the darkness, wasting ammunition, revealing their positions. Pegahmagabow was exhausted. His uniform was soaked through, his hands were numb, but he had run out of ammunition. He had started with 50 rounds, he had 5 left. He crawled back toward the Canadian lines not to sleep, but to get more bullets. He arrived at the Canadian forward trench at 05:30. A young lieutenant looked at him with horror. Pegahmagabow was covered in gray slime. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked more dead than alive. The lieutenant asked, "Corporal, where is your unit?" Pegahmagabow didn't answer. He walked to the ammo crate. He grabbed 3 bandoliers of .303 ammunition. He grabbed a canteen of water. He sat down on a firing step and began to clean his Ross rifle. He disassembled the bolt. He wiped the mud from the raceways. He oiled it. A soldier next to him, holding a Lee Enfield, sneered. "Why don't you get a real gun, Chief? That Ross is going to get you killed." Pegahmagabow didn't look up. He reassembled the bolt. He cycled the action. It was smooth as glass. He looked at the soldier and said quietly, "It hasn't missed yet." He stood up. He drank the water. He put the bandoliers over his shoulder. And then he climbed back over the parapet, back into no man's land. He had killed 14 men, but the battle wasn't over. The Germans still held Mount Sorrel. And Pegahmagabow had 16 more kills to make before his 48 hours were up. The second day, June 4th, would be harder. The Germans knew he was there. They were calling in mortar fire on every shell hole. They were sweeping the ground with machine guns. Pegahmagabow needed a new tactic. He couldn't just hide in a hole anymore. He had to be aggressive. He had to hunt them. At 09:30 on June 4th, 1916, the complexion of the battlefield changed. The wind shifted. It was now blowing from the German lines toward the Canadian positions. Pegahmagabow saw it first, a yellow-green fog rolling over the lip of the trench at Mount Sorrel, chlorine gas. It was heavy, hugging the ground, filling the shell holes where men were hiding. Pegahmagabow was lying in a crater 200 yards from the German line. He had seconds to react. He reached into his satchel and pulled out his PH hood, the P helmet. It was a primitive gas mask, essentially a chemically treated flannel bag with glass eyepieces and a rubber exhale valve. He pulled it over his head and tucked the skirt into his tunic. The world turned dim and yellow through the cloudy glass lenses. Breathing became a struggle. The chemical smell of the mask was nauseating, but for a sniper, the gas mask presented a different problem. You cannot get a cheek weld on the stock of a rifle while wearing a canvas hood. You cannot see clearly through fogged glass. Most soldiers stopped firing during a gas attack. They focused on breathing. The Germans counted on this. They advanced behind the gas cloud wearing their own rubber masks, expecting the Canadians to be incapacitated. Pegahmagabow did not stop firing. He adjusted his technique. He couldn't put his cheek to the stock, so he held the rifle differently, relying on instinct and muscle memory to align the sights. At 09:42, a German NCO emerged from the mist, leading a squad of stormtroopers. He looked like a monster in his gas mask, a silhouette in the fog. Range 150 yards, visibility poor. Pegahmagabow fired, the Ross rifle bucked. The German NCO fell, the squad froze looking for the flash. Pegahmagabow cycled the bolt, click-clack, he fired again. A second soldier dropped. He was shooting blindly, breathless, inhaling recycled air, but he was hitting targets. He killed 5 men in 10 minutes during the gas attack. The German advance stalled. They realized that the gas hadn't cleared the defenders, it had just given the ghost cover. By 14:00, the gas had dissipated, but the German mortars had dialed in. They were walking shells across no man's land trying to flush him out. A mortar shell landed 20 yards from Pegahmagabow's position. The concussion slammed him against the mud wall of his crater. His ears rang. His nose began to bleed. He checked his rifle immediately. Mud had splattered onto the bolt. This was the moment the Ross usually failed. If he tried to fire now, the grit would seize the lugs. Pegahmagabow didn't panic. He took his canteen, poured precious water over the action, and used a piece of his own tunic to wipe the raceways clean. He ray-oiled it. He cycled it. It worked. The weapon that everyone mocked was keeping him alive because he treated it like a living thing. At 16:15, he spotted a high-value target. A German artillery observer was crawling up a sap trench on the left flank, laying telephone wire. If that observer established a line, he could call down precision fire on the Canadian reserves. Range 450 yards. A difficult shot. Pegahmagabow waited. The observer stopped to splice a wire. Crack. The observer slumped over the wire. Minutes later, a second man crawled out to retrieve him. Crack. The second man fell. The telephone line was never completed. The Canadian reserves were safe. As the sun began to set on June 4th, Pegahmagabow had been in combat for 36 hours. He was hallucinating from fatigue. The mud felt like it was pulling him down, but he had 22 kills. He needed to finish the job. He moved closer to the German line, crawling over the bodies of the men who had died in the initial assault. He used the dead for cover. He lay motionless among them for 3 hours, waiting for the moon to rise. If you are amazed by the endurance of one man against an army, please hit that like button. It helps us preserve these stories. And subscribe if you haven't already. We are documenting the greatest feats of World War I back to the trenches. At 01:00 on June 5th, the Germans grew careless again. They believed the sniper must have retreated or died in the mortar barrage. A group of 4 soldiers sat on the parapet eating rations. They were laughing. They were 100 yards away. Pegahmagabow didn't fire immediately. He lined them up. He waited for 2 of them to cross paths. At 01:12, he fired. The bullet passed through the chest of one soldier and struck the man behind him. A double. The other 2 scrambled for their rifles. Pegahmagabow shot the 3rd man before he could stand. The 4th man dived into the trench. 3 shots, 4 kills. The tally was now 26. He spent the rest of the night suppressing the trench. Every time a helmet appeared, he put a bullet through it. Every time a machine gun started to traverse, he put a round into the cooling jacket or the gunner's face. He created a zone of death 400 yards wide. The Germans were paralyzed. They stopped firing flares. They stopped looking over the rim. They huddled in the bottom of their trench, waiting for dawn. At 05:00 on June 5th, the Canadian Relief Force arrived. A fresh battalion moved up to retake the line. They found Pegahmagabow walking back from no man's land. He was unrecognizable. He was covered in blue clay, blood, and chemical residue. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull. He was carrying his Ross rifle and an empty bandolier. An officer asked him for a report. Pegahmagabow simply handed him a piece of paper with coordinates of the German machine gun nests. Then he walked to the rear, laid down in a dugout, and slept for 14 hours. In 48 hours, he had confirmed 30 kills. He had single-handedly suppressed a German company. He had proved that the Ross rifle in the hands of a master was not a broken stick, it was a reaper's scythe. But Mount Sorrel was just one battle. Francis Pegahmagabow fought for the entire war. He survived the Second Battle of Ypres. He survived the Somme. He survived Passchendaele, where the mud was deep enough to drown a horse. He survived the chemical burns of mustard gas. By the end of the war in 1918, his record was almost mythical. Confirmed kills 378, the highest score of any sniper in World War I from any nation. Prisoners captured 300 plus. He was known for creeping into German trenches alone, tapping soldiers on the shoulder and whispering them into surrender. He was awarded the Military Medal. Then he won a bar to the Military Medal. Then he won a second bar. He was one of only 38 Canadians to receive the Military Medal 3 times. He returned to Canada in 1919 as a bona fide war hero. The army disbanded. He took off his uniform. He put his Ross rifle down, and then he faced the greatest betrayal of his life. When he stepped off the train in Parry Sound, Ontario, he was not greeted as a hero. He was greeted as an Indian. According to Canadian law at the time, Francis Pegahmagabow, the man who had killed 378 enemy soldiers and saved countless Canadian lives, was not a citizen. He was a ward of the state. He returned to the Parry Island Reserve. He found that the government had given land to returning veterans, but not to him. Indigenous veterans were excluded from the soldier settlement loans. He applied for a loan to buy a horse. The Indian agent, a bureaucrat who controlled the reserve, denied him. Pegahmagabow had fought for freedom in Europe, but he was not free in his own home. He could not vote. He could not leave the reserve without a pass. He could not buy a beer. He could not hire a lawyer. But Pegahmagabow did not give up. He had fought the Germans, now he fought the bureaucracy. He became chief of the Parry Island Band. He sent letters to Ottawa. He demanded rights for his people. He became a thorn in the side of the government, just as he had been a thorn in the side of the Germans. He was aggressive. He was relentless. He used the same patience he had learned in the mud of Flanders, but the war had taken its toll. His lungs were scarred from the chlorine gas. He suffered from chronic chest pain. He had nightmares where the mud of Ypres was trying to swallow him. In the end, the government tried to erase him. They ignored his letters. They tried to depose him as chief. They treated the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history as a nuisance. Pegahmagabow didn't care. He kept fighting until his body gave out. He died on August 5, 1952, at the age of 61. He died of a heart attack, his lungs finally failing him after decades of struggle. He was buried on the Parry Island Reserve. For years, his grave was marked only by a simple military headstone. The Ross rifle, the weapon he had mastered, disappeared into history. But the legend remained. The soldiers who served with him never forgot Peggy. They remembered the ghost who walked through no man's land. They remembered the sound of the broken rifle cracking in the night. They remembered that when the entire army was panicking, one man stood calm in the mud and did the work. Today, Francis Pegahmagabow is finally recognized. There is a bronze statue of him in Parry Sound. He stands in his uniform, his Ross rifle slung over his shoulder, an eagle on his arm. He looks out over the water, vigilant, eternal. His story is a reminder that the weapon doesn't make the soldier. The heart makes the soldier. The Ross rifle was a failure of engineering, but Francis Pegahmagabow was a triumph of the human spirit. He took a jammed, muddy, hated piece of steel and used it to carve his name into history. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from the archives every single day. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from Canada, the US, the UK, or France? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are helping keep these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Francis Pegahmagabow is never forgotten.